Thank you for coming, to our audience members, to our esteemed guests, expert witnesses, and panelists, and to members of the media. I am Professor Matthew Witt. Joining me as a fellow moderator for the 4 days of our hearings is Professor Michael KEEFER, to my right. We have gathered here at Ryerson University in Toronto for the international hearings on the events of September 11th, 2001. Some might ask why such an assembly should be necessary, here or anywhere 10 years after those events. One reason must be the consensus among historians and political scientists that 9/11 marked a turning point in the history of our time. Everything changed after 9/11. That is a cliche, and perhaps a politically motivated one. However, governmental responses to that day's events have reshaped our world in ways I can only summarize here in the briefest manner. The events of 9/11 have served as a cause or pretext for two major wars, producing incalculable suffering in Iraq and Afghanistan, and increasing instability throughout the Middle East. They have justified historic reversals of formal commitments to civil liberties, multiculturalism, and the protection of minorities among Western nations. And they have led to diversions of resources on a massive and global scale, from public infrastructure of social security, education, and health to apparatuses of war-making, surveillance, and security. But a redirection of resources that has been aimed supposedly at enhancing public safety has had the opposite effect. Among the many commentators one could cite, Paul Craig Roberts writes that Americans are unsafe today, quote, not because of terrorists and domestic extremists, but because they have lost their civil liberties and have no protection from unaccountable government power. How this came about should, he thinks, quote, be worthy of public debate and congressional hearings.
In Canada, let us add, there are parallel grounds for public debate and formal hearings. 24 Canadians were among the direct victims of the 9/11 attacks. 6 times that number of Canadian soldiers have died in Afghanistan in the longest running of the 9/11 wars. And the kettling and mass arrests of more than 1,000 peaceful demonstrators at last year's G20 protests in Toronto, while the police made no attempt to interfere with the actions of a disorderly minority, was one sign of the extent to which civil liberties have declined in post-9/11 Canada. The importance of 9/11 as a historic turning point, then, is not in doubt. But much of what happened on that day, in the period leading up to it, and in its immediate aftermath, remains in doubt, in terms most particularly of the agencies and causalities involved in that sequence of events. A second reason for being here, then, must be the extraordinary disproportion between the weighty and devastating consequences of 9/11 and the implausibility of the official story of 9/11. There have been determined attempts to suppress public skepticism about that official account. Ever since September 14, 2001, when George W. Bush chose the National Cathedral in Washington as the place to announce a global war on terror in response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, figures in government and the corporate media have sought to treat 9/11 as part of a civic religion, to sacralize 9/11 so that it would become an act of impiety, of blasphemy even, to question any part of the official story of what happened. As Gore Vidal has remarked, in media circles, quote, it is an article of faith that there are no conspiracies in American life, unquote. Not surprisingly, conspiracy theory and associated terms of abuse have been tirelessly deployed to intimidate and delegitimize skeptics, to deflect attention away from critical and evidence-based analysis, and to persuade a public already immersed in media spectacle and numbed by sophistry to accept a permanent displacement of rational thinking by ad hominem sneers. Are we then to forget the growing mass of contradictions, misdirections, omissions, and direct falsehoods within the official 9/11 narrative that have been brought to light by the patient, critical research of many public-spirited citizens, among them scholars, scientists, engineers, architects, pilots, and lawyers. Let us remember, rather, how persistent these researchers have been in their exercise of citizenship, and in particular, how persistent family members of the direct victims of 9/11 have been in demanding a full and honest account of the events of 9/11. Even while coping with the raw grief of their bereavement, family members gathered together to exert pressures that compelled an unwilling Bush-Cheney administration, after more than a year of stonewalling, to launch an official inquiry. They attended the hearings of that 9/11 Commission inquiry, expressed their dismay at its mishandling and suppression of evidence, and made trenchant criticisms of the report it published in 2004. More recently, bereaved spouses and parents of 9/11 victims have raised their voices again to protest the equally misleading reports on the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers that have been published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce.
You will be able to hear directly from 3 of these courageous 9/11 family members who will be joining us by video from New York during these hearings. They figure very properly among our expert witnesses because for a decade they have been involved in an unceasing struggle to uncover, through research and political action, the truth about the circumstances in which their loved ones were murdered. Our other expert witnesses will be addressing us on subjects relating to the events of 9/11 on which they possess special knowledge, whether scientific, technical, or scholarly in nature. The evidence our witnesses bring forward will be presented to the hearing's 4 panelists, 3 scholars, and a judge, all of them of high international reputation and distinction, with the rest of us, including audience, media, and moderators, as listeners and observers. The expert witnesses will present evidence to the panelists whose role will be to question the witnesses, to weigh the evidence, and to sum up the panelists' assessment of that evidence in a final report, which will be published as soon as possible after the hearings. Within this structure, and within the confines of a tight 4-day schedule, we want to make as much space as possible for audience participation. During the breaks between witness sessions, we would invite audience members to share written questions with the moderators. We will pass these on to the appropriate witness or witnesses. At the end of each day's exchanges between witnesses and panelists, there will be a question and answer period, during which expert witnesses will be available to respond to oral questions from the audience. Some written questions may also receive responses in those question and answer periods. The others will receive later responses, which will be published in a supplement to the video recording of the hearings. Audience input is important to us, but more important still are the exchanges between our witnesses and panelists. It is essential that our panelists should be able to deliberate carefully while listening to each of the expert witnesses. They may themselves interrupt witnesses with questions or requests for clarifications, and I am confident that you will find the panelists' interventions helpful in coming to your own judgment of the testimony. But Professor KEEFER and I will ask audience members to kindly wait until the question and answer period at the end of each day before posing oral questions. We would also ask you to assist us in the smooth running of these hearings by taking your seats in good time after the beginning of each session and remaining in your places until the end of the session, and by making sure before the beginning of each session that your cell phones are turned off. Our full proceedings, including the question and answer periods, are being videotaped. We would like to ensure that the words of our witnesses and panelists and the words of audience members during the Q&A periods can be clearly heard by everyone. We would therefore ask you not to talk or interrupt during the giving of evidence, during the exchanges between panelists and witnesses, or during the Q&A sessions.
one small slip. Do please take your seats not after but before the beginning of each session. Our 4-day hearings, then, will thus have a quasi-judicial structure. The presentations of the expert witnesses will be evidence-based rather than speculative. The methodologies involved, whether those of the physical or the social sciences, will be rigorous, and the information that the witnesses present will receive a further critical sifting at the hands of the panelists, both in the questions they put to witnesses and also subsequently in their final report. Quasi-judicial, evidence-based, rigorous, these hearings might also be described more generally as an attempt to shed public light on a subject that has all too often been obscured and obfuscated in the mainstream media. In a broad sense, then, we are participating in a project that goes back more than 2 centuries, to the age of the Enlightenment, a central product of which was the great French encyclopédie published by the philosopher Denis Diderot in 28 volumes between 1751 and 1772. One of the encyclopedia's essays praised the ancient Greeks for having invented, quote, that critical philosophy which defies all authority and which, in its search for truth, wishes to be guided by the glimmer of evidence alone, unquote. Another essay of the period, written in 1784 by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, posed the question, Was ist Aufklärung? What is enlightenment? Kant defined enlightenment as a release from the tutelage into which people fall when we allow others, standing as our guardians, to tell us what to think, instead of having the resolution and courage to think critically for ourselves. And he offered as the motto of enlightenment the Latin phrase sapere aude, which means dare to know, or have the courage, have the audacity to know. Daring to think critically about 9/11, to subject the fictions and deceptions that surround that cataclysmic event to the tests of critical inquiry and rigorously sifted evidence. That may indeed be a project requiring some courage and some resolution.
We are pleased and grateful that you, our audience, have chosen to join with us in this project. We thank you in advance for your respectful attention to the exchanges between our witnesses and panelists. Professor Michael KEEFER and I will be providing brief introductions to each one of this hearing's witnesses. We will also be careful to ensure that we keep to the announced schedule throughout the day and throughout the hearings, and we look forward to engaging more fully with audience members during the Q&A period at the end of the day. In the meantime, I would remind you again to kindly pass your written questions to us at the end of each witness session.
It is now my pleasure to introduce James Gourley, the founder and president of the International Center for 9/11 Studies, which is sponsoring these Toronto hearings. James Gourley has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering and is an intellectual property attorney. He has also contributed as author or part author of publications in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, the Open Chemical Physics Journal, and the Journal of 9/11 Studies, to the developing scientific understanding of the events of 9/11. He founded the International Center for 9/11 Studies in order to advance scientific research and educational activities that are at once international in scope and multidisciplinary in nature. The Center is committed to promoting and engaging in data-driven empirical research performed to the highest academic standards, as well as evidence gathering through available legal channels. It is best known to date for its success in securing the public release of tens of thousands of photographs and hundreds of hours of video footage from the National Institute of Standards and Technology under the Freedom of Information Act. Distinguished panelists, James Gourley will explain in greater detail the purpose and procedures of these hearings.
Thank you. On behalf of the International Center for 9/11 Studies, I would like to welcome you to the Toronto hearings as well. And I'm just going to explain basically what are the Toronto hearings, and what will happen over the next 4 days. In general, the hearings are intended to bring attention to the most substantial evidence that has accumulated over the last 10 years, evidence that the 9/11 Commission report and the various reports issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology failed to adequately address, which demonstrates that there is a need for a new, independent, and international investigations into the events of 9/11. The hearings are not a new investigation in themselves. The hearings will provide a succinct summary of the strongest evidence that a new investigation is immediately warranted and that the international community cannot abdicate this responsibility any longer. The format and conduct of the hearings will be analogous to, though not exactly the same as, a legal proceeding, a criminal proceeding that is known in the United States as a grand jury hearing. Other legal jurisdictions have similar mechanisms that are known as preliminary hearings or committal procedures. The common thread among all of these is that after a crime has been investigated, a prosecutor presents his best evidence that the defendant or suspect has committed the crime in question. Typically, the suspect or defendant does not have the opportunity to present counter evidence to the grand jury, but sometimes is invited to do so by the prosecutor. Indeed, at the Toronto hearings, you will not hear testimony from the National Institute of Standards and Technology or the 9/11 Commission, the U.S. government bodies that have promulgated what we refer to as the official government version of 9/11. These parties were invited several times to participate in these hearings, but declined to do so. We cannot help but conclude that these entities will continue to hide behind their various reports until a body with subpoena power or sufficient political clout forces them to appear and defend their work. In a grand jury proceeding, grand jury simply decides whether there is a prima facie case that can be made against the defendant. A prima facie case has been made when evidence has been presented that, unless rebutted, would be sufficient to prove a particular proposition or fact. If the grand jury does find that a prima facie case has been made, then at a separate proceeding known as a trial, which the defendant is required to attend, the case is presented to an adjudicator, usually a judge or jury. At the trial, the defendant has the opportunity to rebut the case with counter evidence. Again, the analogy between the Toronto hearings and a grand jury proceeding is not perfect because there are some differences in format and product of the Toronto hearings. The hearings are not being conducted according to any specific laws or legal procedures, and the outcome will not have the force of law. Also, unlike a grand jury, the evidence will not be presented to citizens chosen at random due to obvious logistical problems. Governments can force citizens to show up for jury duty, but the organizers of the Toronto hearings don't have that ability. Instead of convening a traditional jury panel, we decided to gather together an international panel of prominent individuals who have agreed to do what governments and major media outlets around the world have so far refused to do: look at the evidence objectively and decide whether it deserves wider attention. In selecting panelists, we looked for two qualifications in an individual: someone who is, one, highly credible, and two, open to objectively assessing the evidence. We have certainly found four such individuals who are sitting here at the front of the room, and we are grateful to have such distinguished gentlemen participating in their important role in these hearings. And I'll give each one of them a brief introduction. Ferdinando Imposimato is the honorary president of the Supreme Court of Italy. A former senior investigative judge, he presided over several major terrorism-related cases, including cases involving the kidnapping and assassination of President Aldo Moro, the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II, and the mafia assassination of Carabinieri General Carlo Alberto della Chiesa. In 1984, the French journal Le Point named him Man of the Year, Courageous Judge, and in 1985, the London Times devoted a full page to his work as Scourge of the Mafia, while a book published by the United Nations described him as the symbol of justice. Ferdinando Imposimato is also a former senator who served on the Anti-Mafia Commission in 3 administrations, a former legal consultant to the United Nations on drug trafficking, the co-author or author of 7 books on international terrorism, state corruption, and related matters, and a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Italy. The next panelist is Herbert Jenkins. He's a professor emeritus of psychology at McMaster University in Canada. Educated at Oberlin College and Harvard University, he held positions at Lincoln Laboratories in Massachusetts, at MIT, and at the Bell Telephone Laboratories before going to McMaster in 1963. Herbert Jenkins helped create McMaster's Interdisciplinary Arts and Science program and its Engineering and Society program, and served as director of both. In 2009, Professor Jenkins was awarded an honorary doctorate by McMaster University in recognition of his influential contributions to the psychology of learning and judgment, as well as his leadership in developing models of inquiry-based, interdisciplinary, and socially responsible undergraduate education. And these have had a significant impact on current thinking about curriculum development in Canadian universities. The next panelist is Richard B. Lee. He's distinguished Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Internationally recognized for his ethnographic studies, he has held academic appointments at Harvard, Rutgers, and Columbia University. The author of books that have had a major influence in the discipline and of more than 100 articles and book chapters. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a foreign associate of the National Academy of Sciences. Professor Lee has served as president of the Canadian Anthropology Society and the Canadian Ethnology Society, and holds honorary doctorates from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the University of Guelph. The journal American Scientist has listed his 1979 book on the Kung San people as standing among the 100 greatest scientific works of the 20th century. Our fourth panelist, David Johnson, Professor Emeritus of Urban Planning and Regional Planning at the University of Tennessee. He holds a BA and master's degrees in Architecture and Planning from Yale University and a PhD in Regional Planning from Cornell University. A fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, he served with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and was a planner on the staffs of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, the Washington National Capital Planning Commission, and the Regional Plan Association of New York. David Johnson has been a Fulbright Scholar in India, Thailand, the Soviet Union, and Cyprus, and has served as professor and chair of the planning departments at Syracuse University and at Ball State University. A past president of the Fulbright Association of the United States, he has directed educational projects in Brazil and Portugal, and helped found the Fulbright Prize, whose recipients include Nelson Mandela and Jimmy Carter. So there's no question that the opinion of these gentlemen on the weight and sufficiency of the evidence will carry significant influence in many quarters, as well it should. Over the course of 4 days, the panel will listen to evidence that has been collected over the last 10 years that contradicts the official government version of events. Each witness will present an opening statement and then answer questions posed by the panel. The panel has been given considerable latitude in the subject and nature of the questions they may ask, and we expect the witnesses to answer every question to the best of their knowledge. After the hearings have adjourned on the 4th day, The panel will reconvene over the following weeks and months and make a decision on which aspects, if any, of the evidence presented deserves further investigation by governments with subpoena and political power. The panel will then publish a final report, which I will help draft and edit, setting forth a recitation of the evidence presented and the panel's conclusions regarding the strength of the evidence and recommendations on how to proceed. Now I'll offer just a few brief words on what the Toronto hearings are not. The Toronto hearings are not a trial where there will be an innocent or guilty verdict issued at the end. The hearings are also not a forum to prevent every side of every issue that has ever been raised by skeptics of the official government version of 9/11 and then decide which is correct or which is best. The steering committee, which I'm a member, is playing a role similar to that of a grand jury prosecutor in these hearings. And we have decided which evidence we think is the strongest and most persuasive against the official story. If any in attendance wonder why one particular line of evidence is not being presented at these hearings, the answer will be the same in every case. The steering committee believes the evidence that we have chosen to present is stronger. We are interested in the panelist's opinion on the merits of the evidence we chose to present as against the official version of events promulgated by NIST and the 9/11 Commission. We do not claim to be an authoritative or representative voice of 9/11 skeptics, and the content of these hearings will in no way restrict the scope of any future investigation, whether government-sponsored or not. However, we do believe that the final report of these hearings can serve as a good starting point for all future investigations. September 11th was a horrific event, and we still mourn for those who lost their lives and those who lost loved ones. My hope is that these hearings will take us one step closer to achieving real justice and accountability for the damage that was caused. Please show respect for the panelists, the moderators, the expert witnesses, and other attendees, and especially for those who lost their lives on 9/11, and help us make this event a big success. And right now, I think I'm going to ask everybody to please stand so we can have a moment of silence just in respect for those who lost their lives and those otherwise affected. Thank you.
Our first witness testimony from Lorie Van Auken comes to us in videotaped form. Lorie Van Auken and her two children were bereaved on 9/11 when her husband Kenneth, a bond trader with Cantor Fitzgerald, died in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. She took a leading role in the struggle of a group of 9/11 widows to pressure the Bush administration into launching an independent investigation of the events of 9/11. In testimony to a congressional briefing organized by Representative Cynthia McKinney in July 2005, Lorie Van Auken denounced the 9/11 Commission report as having, quote, yielded more questions than answers, as having, quote, insulted the intelligence of the American people, and as having violated our loved ones' memories, unquote. She concluded, quote, that only an honest reevaluation of how the 9/11 attacks could have happened will allow us to reverse the adverse consequences and overreaching laws and the existing loopholes in security systems in order to allow us to be safer in the future, unquote. Lorie Van Auken's research and her courageous activism, together with the work of the other Jersey widows, were featured in the 2006 documentary 9/11 Press for Truth.
Thank you for continuing on the path to seeking the truth on this 10th anniversary of 9/11 and for inviting me to speak to you. My name is Lorie Van Auken. On September 11, 2001, my husband Kenneth went to work at Cantor Fitzgerald in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Ken was on the 105th floor of Tower 1 when American Airlines Flight 11 hit his building. He left a message that began with "I love you" and went on to let me know that he had felt the building get hit by something. Ken didn't know if he would get out. Essentially, he was calling to say goodbye. I knew that my husband had survived the initial strike, but that's all I knew. It was a harrowing day. As the planes were striking their targets, my mother called and said, "Put the TV on." My sister called as she was heading into Manhattan to see if I knew what was happening in New York City. As we were speaking, the second hijacked plane, United Airlines 175, flew over her head. I remember telling her to just turn around and get away from there. My two kids were 12 and 14 years old and were at school. I was in a panic and didn't know what to do. I called their schools and was assured that my children were both safe and would not hear about the attacks at school. Of course, that was absurd. My son watched the attacks in real time on a TV that the teacher was riveted to. The teacher was unaware that my son was watching from behind. My daughter heard about a plane crashing into her father's office building from another student. While I sat in utter shock from what I was watching on television, I continued to hope for a glimpse of Ken somewhere in the chaos of people running and jumping from buildings. At some point, President Bush was shown sitting in an elementary school class listening to a story about a pet goat. This footage was in a split screen with a video of the World Trade Center that had smoke billowing from a plane-shaped hole. I clearly remember trying to will Mr. Bush to get up and do something, but even after Andrew Card whispered something in his ear, he just continued to sit there. That was my first clue that something was not quite right. Shouldn't the commander-in-chief have a more important job to do while planes are crashing into the World Trade Center than listening to an elementary school class reading lesson? Wasn't the President of the United States himself a potential terrorist target? I thought of my own kids and worried that the children in that Florida school were in harm's way if President Bush was a target. As I continued watching the most unbelievable drama I had ever seen, the World Trade Center building started crumbling and crashing to the ground. The building that was hit first, my husband's building, remained standing as the South Tower, which was hit second, fell. I thought, how did the South Tower get hit in the top corner of the building without that piece of the building falling away from the rest of the structure as you would expect it to? Suddenly, Ken's building exploded into dust as I watched, and people tried to run away from the gigantic wall of smoke and debris that seemed to follow them down the street. Really? Steel-framed skyscrapers could disintegrate just like that? My next-door neighbor picked up my kids from school that day. My parents were up from Florida. They were supposed to head back home on September 11th. They ended up staying with us for a month, attempting to help. As the news spread, our friends and family members seemed to appear from nowhere to sit with us while we waited for the news about Ken's whereabouts and condition. That first night, I got almost no sleep and made hundreds of phone calls to New York City and New Jersey hospitals, as well as the Red Cross, hoping to find my husband alive somewhere. We didn't find out how much our lives would change until 2 days later when Howard Lutnick, the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, appeared on TV. That's when we learned that Ken didn't get out, that no one in the building above the impact of the airplane had gotten out alive. The sadness and horror that shrouded my family after September 11th cannot possibly be conveyed to you. Before long, the gnawing questions started overwhelming me. I wasn't eating or sleeping very much, and instead, I found myself hunched over my computer in my basement, reading and researching every 9/11 related article that I could get my hands on. I read articles from all around the globe, trying to make sense of what had happened. I found that nothing made sense, and I felt I could trust no one to tell me the truth. I started noticing that after September 14th, 2001, the 9/11 stories in all of the newspapers began to look eerily the same. How could every writer be handling the emerging news in exactly the same way? There would eventually be 3 different versions of NORAD's timeline of their 9/11 response. But on September 18th, 2001, the first version was released to the public. Since it seemed that there was little, if any, military intervention during these attacks, the obvious question became, what was the military response on 9/11 supposed to look like? We learned that NORAD had certain protocols to follow for planes that have lost radio contact and for planes that are off their course. There is a separate set of protocols for hijacked airliners. With all of these protocols already in place, how could 4 hijacked commercial airliners fly around the skies of the United States for so long with no military response? How were the hijackers able to evade our country's elaborate defenses? Mindy Kleinberg and I live in the same town, and our husbands work for the same company, but we had never met prior to September 11, 2001. Right after the tragedy, a mutual friend introduced us. Mindy and I began attending a support group that the families affected by Pan Am 103 Lockerbie had set up for the 9/11 families. There we met Bob Minetti, who had lost a child in the crash of Pan Am 103. At another meeting for 9/11 victims' family members, we became acquainted with Patty Casaza and Kristen Breitweiser. We began emailing each other about questions we had. Soon we would learn that there would be only a congressional investigation and only into the intelligence failures that led to 9/11. But by then we knew that every governmental agency had failed us on September 11th. NORAD, the FAA, the DOJ, etc., in addition to the FBI, CIA, and NSA. We wanted an investigation into all of the actions and failures that had led to the deaths of our loved ones and so many others on that horrible September day. Many people couldn't, or more likely didn't want, to hear the difficult questions regarding 9/11 that were emerging. But Bob Minetti listened and encouraged us to go to Washington, D.C. to ask for a comprehensive investigation. We learned that there was a stalled bill proposing a 9/11 commission and decided to go and see if we could light a fire under the lawmakers to push forward with the legislation for an inquiry. Asking for an investigation into 9/11 became a full-time job. The 4 of us planned a rally in Washington, D.C. for June 11, 2001, 9 months after 9/11, to garner support for our cause. Other 9/11 family groups joined forces with us. The rally's attendance was less than we had hoped for, but the press was there and our journey had begun. When seeking meetings in Washington, you are asked for the name of your organization. Thus, the 4 of us, Mindy Kleinberg, Patty Casaza, Kristen Breitweiser, and I, became the September 11th advocates. Soon, other victims' family members from other states began referring to us as the Jersey Girls. Before long, the press picked it up as well. We came to learn that we had some allies and some detractors in Washington. Senator Torricelli, Democrat of New Jersey, and his office helped us with the details of planning our rally. We needed chairs, water, a podium, and a sound system. Representative Chris Smith, a Republican of New Jersey, lent us his chief of staff, Mary Noonan, and she helped us navigate the complex and treacherous terrain of Washington, D.C. The 4 of us set up a meeting with Eleanor Hill, who had led the Joint Intelligence Committee's investigation, the JICI, into intelligence failures. From her, we got confirmation that we needed more than just a scant look at intelligence failures to find out what had gone wrong to allow 9/11 to happen. Gail Sheehy wrote an article about us called 4 9/11 Moms Battle Bush that told our story and brought public attention to our plight. The group of us that would later become the 12 members of the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Commission had now loosely formed. And we learned to split up in order to meet with as many senators and congressmen as we could on a given visit to Washington. We also met a few times with the director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, and his staff, where we were told about the FBI's ongoing Pence bomb investigation. Pence for Pentagon, Penn for Pennsylvania, TT for the Twin Towers, and BOMB, B-O-M, for the exploding planes. The reasons given for why we couldn't have any immediate answers often came from the FBI's ongoing investigation excuse. We were not at all reassured by those meetings. Suffice it to say that raising children alone while having to go to Washington was difficult. We didn't want to stay overnight, so we would rise at 4:30 a.m. in order to be in D.C. on time for early meetings, remain all day, and get back on the road to be home by 11 p.m. As the final language for a bill that would give us the 9/11 Commission was almost agreed upon, we began to notice a lot of foot dragging. Vice President Dick Cheney had clearly been against having an inquiry from the start and was working behind the scenes to keep things from moving forward. Cheney was often seen on TV with some scary reason for why we couldn't have an investigation into 9/11. One time, While we were all together in Representative Porter Goss's office, Goss got a phone call from Cheney telling him to keep negotiating with us. Goss looked flustered by that phone call, and we were beginning to learn how Washington worked. We finally got fed up with the intense runaround that we were getting, with everyone blaming everyone else for the delay. We couldn't take it anymore and asked Senator Lieberman, Democrat of Connecticut, to organize a meeting with all of the involved parties in one room. And to our surprise, he obliged. During that gathering, it became painfully apparent to everyone that it was the Bush-Cheney White House that was causing the stalemate. As the meeting wore on, and it appeared once again that there wouldn't be an agreement to the terms, all of the 9/11 family members that were in attendance stood up in solidarity, saying that we would not leave without an agreement on the legislation. The press was outside waiting to hear about the outcome, and the White House knew it. That was a critical moment and a turning point for us. Finally, the House passed a version of our legislation for an independent investigation. When the Senate voted on their version of the 9/11 Commission bill, we were invited to Washington to witness the event. As the Senate voted on the 9/11 Commission legislation, we were there cheering. Then we learned about conference committees, where the two houses of Congress would mesh the versions of the legislation that each had voted on. We wanted 2 years for the investigation, but got only 18 months. Initially, only $3 million was allotted, compared with $50 million allotted to investigating the Challenger explosion. We wanted subpoena power for each commissioner, but with pressure from the Bush-Cheney White House, there was an agreement made that would allow subpoena power only if the chair and vice chair, or at least 6 commissioners, voted for it. This was a political body split between 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. Getting 6 commissioners to agree to ask for a subpoena would have meant that one person had to jump over to the other side, which was highly unlikely. The commission legislation also gave guidance as to who would appoint the 9/11 commissioners. As per the legislation, President Bush got to choose who would head the commission. His first choice was Henry Kissinger. This news was getting some very negative press. Since Kissinger was informally known as the king of cover-ups, and we had fought long and hard for the creation of an independent investigation into the events of 9/11, this was unacceptable to most of us. Since Kissinger was tapped to head our commission, the Family Steering Committee asked to meet with him in his New York City office. It was as hot as a sauna in his office, and we wondered about the heat as we looked at the photos he had hanging on the walls. We all started peeling off our coats and sweaters. I walked around looking for any photos of Kissinger with the bin Ladens. A lot of research was done in preparation for that meeting, and we had learned that Kissinger and associates had some of the bin Laden family members as their clients. Henry Kissinger didn't want to publicly reveal his client list, but we knew that all of the commissioners were required to do so. After some polite conversation, I felt compelled to ask him directly if he had any Saudi clients or any clients by the name of bin Laden. After I asked my questions, he spilled his coffee and nearly fell off the couch. We'll never know exactly why, but the next day Kissinger resigned. President Bush then named Tom Kean, the former governor of New Jersey, as chairman of the 9/11 Commission, which was now taking shape. Various congressional leaders picked the balance of the commissioners. As we did our research, it became clear that all of the members that had been chosen for the commission had some conflict of interest. It began to appear as if the choices had been made by those in power more for the purpose of covering political backs than for the purpose of a comprehensive investigation. Our fight for the commission took 14 months. The Family Steering Committee first met with Governor Kean in his office at Drew University in New Jersey, and after all 10 commissioners were named, we met with them for the first time to lay out our concerns. At that meeting, we asked them to subpoena early and often. At that meeting, everyone seemed sympathetic. The 9/11 Commission had been passed into law. However, the work could not begin until all of the commissioners and staff received their security clearances. This took far too long. They also needed to find and furnish office space in Washington, D.C. and New York City. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking on our investigation. The first commission hearing was in March of 2003. Unbeknownst to us, our real work was just beginning. As watchdogs of the commission, the next 2 years of our lives were exhausting and exasperating as we battled the White House, Congress, the commission's executive director, Philip Zelikow, and at various times both with and against the 9/11 commissioners themselves on the various issues that arose. We fought along with the commissioners to get more money for the commission, to get an extension of time, to get access to important White House documents, and to get Condoleezza Rice to testify. We battled against the commissioners, trying to get them to subpoena recalcitrant witnesses and agencies, and were outraged when we learned they were using minders in interviews. We tried in vain to get them to fire their conflict-laden executive director, Philip Zelikow, and fought against allowing Bush and Cheney to testify together in a void with no transcript and no press. We let them know when they fell short of asking hard-hitting questions. We went to every open hearing, hoping that the commissioners would ask tough questions. I can recall only a few instances during the 12 public hearings that we were actually pleased with the vigor of questioning. For example, we gave Richard Benveniste high marks for his questioning of Condi and the uncovering of the August 6 PDB, which emerged as a key document. As executive staff director of the commission, Philip Zelikow really ran the show, deciding what topics would be covered at the hearings and who would be called to testify. After some cursory research, we found out that in 1995, he and Condoleezza Rice had co-authored a book called Germany Unified and Europe Transformed, a study in statecraft. They had worked together in the first Bush White House and had both been members of the second Bush's transition team in 2000-2001. As our intense monitoring of the 9/11 Commission continued, we found that there were even more insidious conflicts surrounding Dr. Zelikow. In his work for President Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the PFIAB, Zelikow helped write the plans for the Iraq War. The Family Steering Committee immediately put out a press release. Quote, "It is apparent that Dr. Zelikow should never have been permitted to be Executive Staff Director of the Commission. As Executive Staff Director, his job has been to steer the direction of the Commission's investigation, an investigation whose mandate includes understanding why the Bush administration failed to prioritize the al-Qaeda threat. It is abundantly clear that Zelikow's conflicts go beyond just the transition period." The press release went on to request Zelikow's resignation. We also wrote a letter directly to the commissioners reiterating this issue, going even further by stating, quote, "It is now apparent why there has been so little effort to assign individual culpability. We now can see that that trail would lead directly to the staff director himself." Again, we asked for his immediate resignation. Our urgent requests were denied. This was not the ideal formula for an independent investigation. The 9/11 families, or at least some of us, were hoping for a real investigation with scholars and experts in the appropriate fields and evidence to back up the work. We had wanted true independence from politics. We had fought so hard to get this commission and did not want someone who clearly had huge conflicts of interest to be running the investigation. But unfortunately, that's what we got. Zelikow split the commission into 8 teams, with each one covering a specific topic. The Family Steering Committee set up conference calls with whichever team was in charge of the upcoming hearing. Zelikow or his assistant, Chris Kojum, monitored the calls. The FSC wrote questions that we felt needed to be asked, and as we sat at the 9/11 Commission hearings, we prayed that our questions would be posed. Sometimes our questions and concerns were addressed, but more often they weren't. If one of our questions was asked, the follow-up was mostly non-existent, which basically let the witness completely off the hook. If a witness didn't have the information that they were being asked about and said that they would send the information along at a later date, we never knew if they had kept their promise. In the beginning, no witnesses were even sworn in. And the subpoena power that we had fought so hard for them to have was not being used. The first time the commissioners used their subpoena power was on the FAA in October of 2003, almost a year after the formation of the commission. In November of 2003, they issued their second subpoena to NORAD with threats of more subpoenas to come, but none were issued. Soon we were told by Zelikow not to send our questions directly to the commissioners. We didn't adhere to that rule and continued to forward our questions along. We were appalled to learn that all the witnesses called before the 9/11 Commission were interviewed with minders in the room. This sounded to us more like tactics that would be used to control people's responses, not an open search for the truth. The commission finally got catapulted into the media spotlight after Richard Clarke's book, Against All Enemies, was released. The coverage really heated up when the family staged a walkout to protest the fact that Richard Armitage was called in to testify in place of Condoleezza Rice. Ultimately, the White House capitulated and allowed Rice to testify. Under questioning from Richard Benveniste, Condi revealed that the title of the August 6, 2001 Presidential Daily Brief, the PDB, was "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States." She claimed that the document was historical and did not speak of a domestic threat. I felt that her claims were patently ridiculous and color-coded the August 6 PDB to show where the threats highlighted were both domestic and current. In one of our appearances on Hardball with Chris Matthews, I showed and explained my version of the document. In July of 2004, the 9/11 Commission released its final report. We wanted time to read it before commenting publicly, but it didn't take long for us to realize that the report was a huge disappointment. Many important topics weren't covered, and far too many of our questions remained unanswered. Everyone was at fault, therefore no one was at fault, was the Commission's mantra. To us, that just sounded like a hollow excuse for finding no one accountable. With the passage of time, more evidence has come to light showing that the Commission's report was less than a complete investigation. The official 9/11 story is based on tortured confessions, and legal experts acknowledge that evidence based on torture is not reliable. Philip Zelikow himself has even tacitly acknowledged this. In 2006, Kane and Hamilton released a book called Without Precedent, The Inside Story of the 9/11 Commission. In it, they state that they knew that NORAD had lied to them, but never followed up to get the full story from NORAD. They also cataloged their concerns about Phil Zelikow. Contrary to the assurances we had received from them regarding Zelikow during the Commission's tenure, in their book, they admit to having had their own reservations about him. Slowly, other commissioners came out with similar comments, and staff members such as John Farmer have written books that speak of issues within the Commission. Philip, a New York Times reporter, wrote an in-depth book about the Commission which shows how Phil Zelikow derailed the investigation. If information came up during an interview that did not fit in with what he had decided the storyline would be, he would not allow the new information to be investigated. For example, documents from the NSA were never even looked at, even though they were a potential treasure trove of information. 10 years after the 9/11 attacks, the old questions still linger and new ones have arisen. A real investigation into 9/11 has never been done. This is incredible considering the direction that we have taken as a country. The passing of the Patriot Act, entering 2 wars, and our entire foreign policy has all been based on the official account of 9/11. The proper place for the 9/11 proceedings would be a courtroom with subpoena power, rules for swearing in witnesses, and established protocols for handling questioning, cross-examination, and evidence. And ultimately, one would hope, real accountability for the actions that led to the deaths of so many. A reporter recently asked me if there is anywhere at all that we can still take our unanswered questions. My answer, sadly, was no. Many of the events that occurred on 9/11 were caught on video, so it is still possible to see the evidence of the unfolding crime. Forums such as this one, set up to scrutinize the events of September 11th, are critical. I want to thank you all for taking the time to gather together on this 10th anniversary in order to explore the issues and continue asking the questions that have never been answered regarding the events of September 11th, 2001.